So the next thing we do then is say, well, let's look at some cases of big migration. So the United States is one. So prior to 1920, the United States had essentially free migration, with the exception of in the late 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Acts that limited some immigration there. But otherwise, we had complete free immigration. And interestingly, by the way, especially in the late 19th century, this is a substitute on the margin for free trade. Instead of factories moving between countries, which workers were best suited to the factory moved to the place the factories were. If my accent hasn't given it away, I'm originally from Boston. I grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, known as the Shoe City. Went to the University of Massachusetts, Lowell undergraduate. Lowell, of course, heart of industrial revolution in the United States, had ancestors who worked in these factories. But if you look at who worked in these factories over time, it started out as mostly women who left the farm and worked in them. They were replaced with Irish immigrants, who were later replaced with Italian and other Southern European immigrants, who were replaced with Eastern European and Jewish immigrants. As different labor forces were best suited to doing the work, the labor force moved to the factory rather than what we have today, which is the factory moving to the workers. So the United States, during our first 150 years, essentially, had free immigration. And then the question is, what impact did it have on US institutions? And I have two noted free market economists here on this slide, of Frederick Engels and Karl Marx. I joke, of course, they're not free market economists. And their analysis of immigration in the United States was actually spot on. So here I am, a pro-market economist, favorably citing Marx and Engels. And what they realized was that free immigration to the United States was limiting the advance of their socialist agenda. It limited unionization by having different workers coming in greater quantities with different backgrounds. It limited worker solidarity and the ability to promote unionization. Except, of course, unionization, both in Europe and in the United States in the late 19th century, was a big push towards bigger government and restrictions on free markets, a degradation of economic freedom, if you will. Also, it made the native born look less favorably on a welfare state. So as a result, it helped limit the size and growth of government. And what we find is actually federal and state expenditures and local tax rates are negative related to the amount of immigration occurring over this time. And in some sense, when you just think about growth of government in the United States, the left of these charts looks at federal expenditures, and the right looks at total immigrant stock as a percent of the population. And what you see is government growth is biggest when immigrant stock is lowest. Closing the borders in the 1920s, which remained essentially closed until 1965, that coincides with the biggest increase in size of government. Ditto when you look at federal outlays as a percent of the economy, and the fractionalization, so the ethno-linguistic fractionalization of the population. When we have a more diverse population, government growth is smaller. Now, this one I want to spend a couple minutes with because it's more modern. Is Israel is kind of a natural experiment where you get a mass migration. It can look at what happens to institutions. And a mass migration that's not generated by a change of policy of the country the immigrants are coming to, but rather an exogenous shock, something that comes from the outside. So Israel, essentially since its creation, has had what it calls the law of return, which allows any Jewish person worldwide to immigrate to Israel and have instant citizenship that includes voting rights and access to the welfare state. This policy has been in existence. It wasn't something that changed. What changed in 1989 is the Soviet Union got rid of its emigration restrictions. It ceased keeping people locked in the Soviet Union and allowed them to move. As a result, many fled, and for many, they went to Israel as a result. So Israel's law of return is very generous in who they define qualifies. It's Jewish people, children and grandchildren of Jewish people, and their non-Jewish spouses. So you get this massive inflow from the Soviet Union. And when you look at this, this is annual percent migration coming in there, but cumulatively over the 1990s, 20% change in the population from countries from the former Soviet Union. That's the orange line. That's a big migration inflow from people who are coming from a country that has a 70-year history of no economic freedom and no political freedom. If they come and import with them their beliefs that were responsible for the Soviet institutions, then that would be a case where, especially with instant voting rights, they should take down the economic freedoms in Israel and make it less productive. So now the obvious objection to this case study is, come on, it's Israel. This is it religiously and culturally homogeneous? Are they all wanting to be part of the Zionist project? This is different than third world migration. Well, actually, when you look at it though, because of the expansive definition of who qualifies, most of these people are not migrating to be part of a Zionist project. 3/4 of them are secular. Only 1.4 identify as particularly religious. 49% of them wanted to go somewhere else. It's just they didn't have another feasible option. Under 15% of them spoke a Jewish language. Most of them all spoke Russian. Most of them thought Russian culture was superior to Israeli culture. Basically, it's normal kind of push mode of bad conditions in Soviet Union pushes migrants out. They chose Israel not because of some cultural or religious affinity, but because it would accept them. The one caveat that's different than third world migration in today is that many of these people had higher human capital. They weren't all low skilled. Many of them were educated. So that's the difference, not the religious or cultural part so much. So what happens? Just looking at the raw data, economic freedom in Israel improves by 45% in the 1990s. They go from below the global average to above the global average, from ranking 92nd in the world to ranking 45th. This is a big improvement in economic freedom. And those 5 areas of freedom I mentioned to you, of economic freedoms, all but one increased substantially over this period. The one that doesn't is size of government. And that's largely because transfers and subsidies improved because immigrants had instant access to the welfare state. But they didn't change the welfare state, just the actual payments went up, so measured freedom went down. When you look to 15 years later, by 2005, it had basically recovered to its previous level on that measure. So what we really want to know, though, is how does Israel do compared to what the counterfactual would be if it didn't receive this migration? So this is a technique used in social sciences now called synthetic control. And the simplest way to think about it is really we want 2 Israels here. An Israel that gets the mass migration and an Israel that does not, and then compare them to each other where the only thing that's different is that. We don't have those 2 Israels. You know, the worlds of North and South Korea to compare 2 economic systems where everything else is fairly constant doesn't lend itself to this in most situations. So synthetic control basically creates a fake Israel that acts exactly like the real Israel up until it gets its migration and then says, well, then how do they depart? So to do that, that's what this chart's doing. You put the year 1990 in when the immigration inflow starts. And for the 15 years before that, you calibrate it such that you create a weighted average of countries, in this case from the OECD countries, Middle East and North African countries, put a bunch of variables in that would track performance between the countries, and then say what weighted average of all of these countries best tracks Israel. And you can see the difference between the dotted line and the thick line before 1990 are pretty small. They track each other pretty well. Then after 1990, you say, what happens? Well, the dotted line, the fake Israel, doesn't improve nearly as much as the real Israel. The real Israel got the mass migration, the fake Israel did not. And we can do some different robustness tests of moving the timing of this. We can use every country that was in there and construct basically a placebo to say, how well does this relationship happen if you do this for every other country and you find Israel's by far the outlier? Then you can also look and say, well, what's the mechanism? What's making it happen? And you had a pretty even balance of power between the right-leaning parties and the left-leaning parties in Israel at this time. And with the Israeli immigrant surge, you can see, I mean, sometimes just looking at the raw evidence, you don't need fancy statistical techniques. the left-leaning Labor Party stopped using the color red in their political advertisements because they didn't want to alienate the vote of former Soviet, of immigrants from the former Soviet Union. If they were wanting to import their socialist beliefs with them, this would not be the case. They're active participants in the political system. They established their own Russian political parties, some of which win seats in the legislature by 1996. They become a member of the governing coalition. Basically, Soviet immigrants, much like Cuban immigrants to the United States, did not want to recreate socialism in their destination. They were more pro-freedom than even the existing native-born population, or the existing, in Israel's case, the long-term resident population that had already been